Okay, so these are longer poems, most of them. So they don't get into the shorts category, which means in this YouTube playlist, they don't get pawned off by YouTube and then therefore seen just in anybody's algorithmic list of clips. And YouTube is really good to send these clips when they're less than a minute long. So, I think it's November 2022 are these poems. I would recommend give them a listen, because I think that the poems that I can read, that I write and are in this 21-year project, if one only got a glimpse of the project through the shorts, the less than 1 minute long read poems, then one doesn't get a very good picture of the project. Just so you know, that's my little advertisement to try to listen to some of the longer ones as well, and this is one of those. It was posted Friday, November the 18th, 2022. It's number 3771. It's called A Tough Tête-à-tête. Like a ventriloquist's voice is the voice we hear coming from the dummy as thrown through the dummy at you, given that you, the audience, have the all-important willing suspension of disbelief, and with dummies that suspension seems pretty steady. When the voice that belongs to the man who's wearing the exterior of the dummy says, "You didn't hear it from me," there's a bit of double take regarding who actually made such a pronouncement. Who said that? The audience wonders. The dum-dum or the ventriloquist. Even as they're not too dumb to know the actuality. Even the tiny creeps all the way in the balcony can see me, taunts the puppet. The voice that is its voice rises up and through the rafters of the Grand Theater and floats all the way back to the nosebleed section. It's the nosebleeds who'd be more likely fooled by what's happening on stage, given that they're far too back to see lips move. They're too far back to see lips move, and much less a wide dummy's mouth go through its various bits. As it turns out, there's one man sitting up in the last row of the balcony who's become incapable to see the world about him as it is, more or less sees nothing, so it can be said that he is just about as dumb as a puppet. Unlike our wooden performer on the stage, however, he's a hull of a man within which there exists little else than an entanglement of motion. But even that is swiftly being dumbed down. As our focus leaves the stage, it is now on this man, who has been quite obviously sobbing for some time, for he has lost his last chance with the object of his undying love. The source that had been his every motivation, the person with whom he was inextricably connected, he slowly begins to become slightly aware of the intermittent laughter that carries on around him, and this soothes his spirit just a bit, enough so that the sniffles and snot relatively quieten and become somewhat staunched, respectively. He'd been waiting all day in front of the cafe for her exit, which would always transpire at precisely 5 p.m. each weekday. He had everything ready, and all he had planned to say was branded into his brain. He'd been parked across the street from the tired retail outlet where she'd worked for over 15 years now. Since late morning, he'd been here. His mode of transport, an old Kawasaki he had hidden in the shade at the end of the lot furthest away from her store in case she were to roam the area during one of her breaks or her lunch hour. He was ready to whisk her away, something they talked about for years now. It was to be a surprise, though, so she was unaware that today was the day, unaware perhaps that it was more than a mere fantasy, all that talk of riding away one day into the sunset. But when finally out she walked into the late afternoon haze that the sun strained through with some success, something unequivocal occurred, and like a wolf trapped in a tailspin on a gray, wind-blown tundra, his tongue, his whole body, in fact, froze into a stiff mess, and he was unable to move. Found it impossible to make even a yelp of any kind that would be audible enough to reach his beloved. His entire speech Every last gesture he choreographed and practiced for months, just for one moment, vaporized as he watched her practically skip down the sidewalk in the opposite direction, her white skirt dancing with the back of each of her knees, which closed a bit, then widened out straight, then closed just a bit, then widened out straight as she skip-walked, a movement that reminded him of the dummy's mouth as cranked by the ventriloquist on the set of the town theater, where he would, once his muscles finally loosened enough that he could move, find himself attending, unaware of how he even got there. At the back edge of a balcony with no easy way to escape, flummoxed, lost, knowing now that it was all just a long, drawn-out fantasy, their talk of running away together. He convinced himself that she thought the same. That is, if she wasn't simply placating him by going along with his every desire. Before the performance wound down, he found himself somehow astride his motorcycle. He flipped the kickstand, revved up the engine, and rode off into the darkness alone. And he really never stopped riding, except when he met whatever town the road brought him to of an evening or night. And if early enough, he'd find the town center where perhaps an opera was being performed, or a community theater's production of a Shakespearean comedy or tragedy, a dive bar performance by a strung-out band, or a stand-up comedy open mic, or a dark film in some worn-down cinema. Whatever the genre of the performance, he would find himself there, where he'd sit for a bit, as far back as he could get from the stage and whatever was transpiring upon it, and think about movement and stillness. Movement and stillness. Until, like a blur, he was gone once again, riding even faster into the darkness by which he could never quite become fully and endlessly enveloped, much as he tried, conscious or not, of what he was attempting. One day, of course, he would, inevitably,